jump right in with the introductory lecture of Jelena Novak. It's my great pleasure to introduce her. She's a principal researcher and assistant professor at the CESEM, C-E-S-E-M, the Center for Music Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities of the Nova University in Lisbon. She also works as a writer, dramaturg, music critic, editor and curator, bringing thereby together critical theory and contemporary art practice always. She studied musicology, art theory, media theory, and cultural analysis in Belgrade, Oslo, and Amsterdam, where she earned her PhD in 2012. Her fields of interest are truly interdisciplinary, spanning across and connecting modern and contemporary music, recent opera, singing and new media, capitalist realism, voice studies, and feminine identities in music. She has been a founding committee member for the Society of Minimalist Music and a founding member of the editorial collective TKH, Walking Theory, a journal for performing arts theory. In 2013, she won the Turnau Award for Music Theater Studies from the University of Bayreuth. Her theoretical work has shaped critical research on contemporary forms of opera, which she terms post-opera, through several books on the subject and articles in leading international journals and edited volumes. For our context here, I would like to highlight her book Post-Opera, Reinventing the Voice Body, published by Routledge in 2015, in which she draws on Slavoj Žižek and Mladen Dolar to conceptualize the problematic relationship or the gap between voice and body. She also contributed to the 2023 volume The Sound of Žižek, Musicological Perspectives on Slavoj Žižek, with an article titled Singing in the Age of Capitalist Realism, The Pervert's Guide to Post-Opera. The topic of today's lecture is Singing in the End Times, Post-Opera in Disorder. Thank you so much, Jelena, for being here. I'm very excited what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Good morning, everyone, and also thank you very much, Nico and Pavel, for inviting me to this beautiful city for the first time. So for this lecture today, I had stolen, as Mikhail said, one example from my text that I wrote for this book, reworked it, and also added another examples that I will show to you. Let me put this quote of Žižek first. Never in my life did I dance or sing. It is too obscene. It is obscenity of gestures. I cannot do it. He said that in an interview with Charlie Rose in 2011. The interview it's online. So my personal history with opera courted perversity from the start. Born into a middle-class anarcho-communist family in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, I was predestined to be anything but the typical opera listener. The art of opera was not much favored in my social milieu. As Žižek, then compatriot, I grew up with mass songs celebrating the heroism of the anti-fascist struggle in World War II. The echoes of those mass songs then intersected with my adolescent experience of vital, animated voices from the world of pop and rock. Today I understand the failure of these multiple voices of my youth to unite, and in doing so to serve as any kind of metaphor for the putative unity of brotherhood of the people of Yugoslavia, a country that was already disintegrating while I was growing up. Moreover, the undoubtedly impressive sound of the choral mass songs of my childhood was a dictate from the state and a constant reminder that one had an obligation to act collectively. As for opera, at that time it was simply off my radar. In my first encounter with conventional opera, I was amazed by the disruptiveness of its visual spectacle. What bothered me was partly the obscenity of movement, noted by Žižek in the epigraph, where he records his feeling of disgust about singing and dancing. More precisely, it was the obscenity of mortified singing bodies of elaborately costumed characters with heavy makeup and wigs, standing as though paralyzed on stage, while at the same time producing spectacular, quasi-aristocratic and well-behaved vibrato singing, capable of, quote, screaming over the orchestra. This is the quote from composer Louis Andriessen, when he explains how that happened in romantic world of opera. Wherein exactly lies the obscenity I registered at that time? I believe it was above all the disturbed and frankly bizarre ventriloquism that characterized the relationship between the singing body and the sung voice. To put it simply, the voices that were heard on stage did not at all match the bodies that actually produced them. Later, I wrote about this body-voice gap in more detail, discussing the operatic singing body and its reinvention in recent operatic works that I call post-operas. In post-opera book, I examined ways in which the relationship between the singing body and the voice may be theorized by referring to how the concept of the vocalic body, developed by Stephen Connor, the body produces the voice, but also is produced by that same voice, is reinvented in the context of opera studies. I dissected the singing body as an object of what Slavoj Žižek calls a naive ideological consciousness, a set of rules, protocols, effects, and strategies that are embedded within a specific context, a reality. They are not theorized. On the contrary, as they are a constitutive part of this specific form of reality, they simply occur in what it seems to be a natural, quasi-intuitive way, a kind of second nature. That dissection pulls out the singing body from its invisible, inaudible status and shows how a singing body acts within the world of opera, what interventions it makes, and how it constitutes opera's meanings. Žižek's theorization of the common body-voice relationship inspired my interpretation of the body-voice gap within opera. He questions the core of body-voice relationship, describing its paradoxical mechanism. The voice acquires a spectral autonomy. It never quite belongs to the body we see, so that even when we see a living person talking, there is always some degree of ventriloquism at work. It is as if the speaker's own voice hollows him out and, in a sense, speaks by itself through him. If this gap is already detectable at the level of the common speaker on the stage of conventional opera, it is magnified. It becomes a feature that is too often simply not noticed and that we, the audience, are supposed to accept without questioning as a blind spot. My main problem with opera was that I could not pretend that this blind spot was something normal. For me, it was a knot that redefined the whole world of meanings produced by opera. Here I will refer to the scene from the film by Paolo Sorrentino that illuminates the body-voice gap in an unexpected way. Although no one in the scene sings, I find the whole scene quite operatic in its ventriloquist nature. The scene features Aldo Cavallo introducing himself to his fiancée family. It is characterized by a awkward tension, primarily driven by his use of a device to multiply his voice. It's an electrolarynx. Aldo, trying to be polite and engaging, speaks with a mechanical buzzing voice quality which amplifies family reserved manner. The ventriloquist quality of the scene creates tension similar to the one that is found in opera buffa, while almost all the family members break into uncontrollable and hysterical laughter. The family waits for the pair to arrive for lunch. It takes a long time before they arrive, and patriarch of the family is already a bit nervous. And in this insert that I managed to arrange for the presentations, for some reason I couldn't put the subtitles, so I just read very shortly the text. When he presents himself, he says, "I'm Aldo Cavallo, retired Venetian police officer, amateur pastry chef, and official fiancé of your sister Luisella Schilly. My intentions are very serious." Then he is asked what intentions. He says, "I want to marry her and make her happy for the eternity." Then the patriarch comments, "But you are 8 years old, let's aim for Christmas." And then he starts again, "I'm 70, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I exercise every morning, etc." So I will show you the excerpt. Okay, that was the insert. I found it very interesting, this insert, because no one sings there, but it's very obvious to me that somehow the director had the opera in mind with this whole scene. I didn't investigate further for this occasion, but I intend to see if there is some interview or if he talks somewhere about this scene. But I think that this gap that is here totally obvious, and it's because of the handicap that this character has. He needs to use the device to produce his voice, and it creates all kinds of almost comic effects here. But I think that this scene illustrates very well this profound body-voice gap that happens in opera, in conventional opera, with this specific also style of singing, but also in contemporary opera and in each and very situation of singing. Because the moment when the singing starts, I think that it has to do with denial of realism in some kind of way. When the singing starts, what is sang about stops to become real in some kind of way. So then this gap starts to work, and this mechanism of representation is put into the machine. So at the very beginning of The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, Žižek manifestly proposed that cinema is ultimate art of perversion. Quote, "It doesn't give you what you desire, it tells you how to desire," he claims. He later validates this claim by analyzing a series of examples from the history of film depicting particular scenes that in his analysis reveal themselves as tilting point moments that decipher how the ideological mechanism functions for the film in question, mostly by way of psychoanalytical discourse. The series of short and illuminating narratives presented by Žižek intersect with movie excerpts showing the scene that he discusses. Intriguingly, Žižek's appearances in the documentary are themselves staged. He finds himself embodying characters from the depicted scenes in settings that appear to have been replicas of the sets of the relevant film fragments. That way, The Pervert's Guide to Cinema has a strong documentary flavor, and this strengthens our belief in Žižek's narrative. On the other hand, the obvious falseness of the staging, Žižek was not actually on the sets of discussed films, introduces an ironic dimension. In many of those operas that engage with documentary or quasi-documentary subjects, the ultimate perversity lies in the fact that the realistic situation the opera intends to depict stop looking like reality as soon as the singing begins. Most conventional operas consciously ignore this problem, pretending that opera's inability to represent in a realistic manner does not exist. They simply continue to reproduce another operatic blind spot without questioning it. However, the example that I'm going to show further discuss this kind of gap. And the opera is Aliados, the real-time opera from 2013. The composer is Sebastian Rivas, and libretto was written by Esteban Buch, musicologist and dramaturg, both from Argentina and working between Buenos Aires and Paris. So, the day is 26th of March, 1999, and Baroness Margaret Thatcher meets the arrested dictator Augusto Pinochet and his wife Lucia Iriarte Pinochet in what is to become an historical meeting at Wentworth Estate in Surrey. The meeting is covered in the media and parts of it are broadcast. The general expresses his love and gratitude to the Iron Lady while she addresses him as follows. I know how much we owe to you for your help during the Falklands campaign. Both Thatcher and Pinochet look grotesque in the documentary footage. The Iron Lady, elegant in a green dress and with a stiff, authoritative pose, and General Pinochet with a determined expression and slow, deliberate gestures designed to reveal his tender side. In my view, the documentary footage of this encounter looks like a staged performance, where gratitude for political favors is exchanged in an almost operatic manner, and where the grotesquerie of the event seems more redolent of music drama than of the real, the politically real world. Even looking at the elevated bodily position in the footage, I can easily imagine that the trio of characters is actually singing. Pinochet helped Britain in the 1982 Falklands War, and Thatcher then returned the favor in 1999 by supporting his attempt to avoiding extradition to Spain to stand trial. In an attempt to save her reputation, she insisted on the much contested democratic credentials of Pinochet's rule. We see the image of a friendly home visit, which in reality was heavily weighted with political agendas. So I show you the clip from Associated Press here. It's this one. It comes as no surprise that this documentary material can be expanded into an entire opera. Aliados, Alice, an opera du temps, the real time, as it stands in the score, composed by Sebastian Rivas on a libretto of Esteban Buch, stage director Antoine Gint. The reenactment of the documentary scene of Margaret Thatcher visiting Pinochet lies at the core of the opera, and all other events represented in it are seen through the lens of this particular visit. Aliados starts by portraying the empty stage on which the living corpse of an Argentinian soldier covered with a white cloth is fighting for air. He represents one of the 323 soldiers who were killed when the Argentinian naval cruiser General Belgrano was attacked by a British submarine during the Falklands War in 1982. In this opening scene, there is also a cameraman who is filming the victim while documentary material from the newspaper reports of these events is projected onto the backdrop of the stage. Then the frontal transparent screen slowly parts, revealing projections of the documentary images of the General Belgrano, the submarine, the soldiers, and various military scenes. So I will just play a short trailer from the opera. Yeah, the whole recording is online, so it's possible to see it. In the increasing space revealed by the parting screen, our gaze is drawn to a more intimate setting, to the room in which an old and disoriented General Pinochet is depicted sitting in a wheelchair, cared for by his aides. Members of the audience may begin to feel that they too have come to visit Pinochet. On the floor, a map is laid out like a carpet, while documentary images continue to be projected onto the back wall of the stage. The live broadcast material from the cameraman is rich in close-ups, but we zoom in on the individual characters only, not on entire stage, and the image of the music ensemble remains cut off. In general, many more specific details become visible. We witness the cameraman's version of the story as well as of the story itself, both simultaneously unfolding right in front of our eyes. The cameraman stands there as a reminder of the fluctuating border between the mediatized and the real. As the scene focusing on Pinochet begins to develop, the character of Margaret Thatcher and her aide also emerge. The singer in the role of Thatcher wears a dark green dress so that even physically we are reminded of the ex-prime minister's appearance on the day of that historical visit. An operatic reenactment of the televised real-life encounter then takes place. In its ironic approach, it recalls the opera Nixon in China by John Adams and Peter Sellers, where Richard Nixon, his wife Pat, and Henry Kissinger fly to Beijing to meet Mao Zedong. From that moment, the close-ups of documentary footage give way to an emphasis on the grotesque elements of the tea-time encounter between Thatcher and Pinochet. They exchange greetings, offer each other their books while posing for the camera, and as they make themselves comfortable and start to drink their tea. Thatcher begins to list the various ways in which the Chilean helped the British during the Falklands War. During the Falkland campaign, Thatcher's character sings, repeating this in a suddenly stiff and slow-motion way, almost as though holding her breath on some of the long notes. "The information you gave us," she continues, "communications," and holds again an unusually long note, while the Pinochet character looks in an astonishment. This unexpected slowing down of the singing, together with the change on its color, volume, and character, affects the whole field of meaning. It is as if the Thatcher and Pinochet characters are continuing their chat while her voice remains hovering above them as a partial object. In this respect, the scene strongly recalls the kind of partial object that Žižek mentions in relation to the figure of Cheshire Cat in the Walt Disney's animated version of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. When the cat disappears, only her smile stays on the screen, functioning as an uncanny partial object, a disquieting organ without body. The operatic scene continues, and suddenly, a familiar motive, a recognizable riff from the Clash's 1979 song London Calling, from the album of the same title, is heard in an instrumental ensemble. The anti-establishment subculture associated with punk rock now confronts the strangulated voice of Margaret Thatcher. It is a striking, unexpected, and revealing moment. And I'm going to wrap up slowly here. With music, I prepared another example, but maybe, I'm not sure, I think we don't have time now to play it, to see this particular moment. But to continue with dialogue with Žižek, with music, we cannot ever be sure. Žižek remarks in his interpretation of a scene from the film The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin in The Pervert Guides to Cinema. The scene which Chaplin acts as a Hitler is accompanied by the music of the overture from Wagner's opera Lohengrin. Exactly the same music is used later in the same film when Chaplin plays the part of a young Jew promoting anti-fascist values. This ambiguity of musical signification is what Žižek has in mind when he notes music is potentially always a threat. And something similar happens in this particular moment of Aliados. While Thatcher chokes out her artificial gratitude to Pinochet, the music from Clash speaks out against her, exposing the absurdity of the whole situation. The unpleasant dimension of hiccuping voice, struggling for breath, is domesticated and rendered bearable by its dissonance with a simultaneously sounding punk hit. 10 minutes more, okay. Okay. From that point on, it becomes clear that the two former leaders are tragically comedic, and the opera progresses towards its most absurd scene when the two allies are parodied to the point of the extreme caricature. Argentinian tango music is heard from the ensemble, and the two aides following the two leaders start to dance while embracing one another. La mano al mano somos invencibles. Hand in hand we are invincible, sings Pinochet. Their dance is strangely neurotic, and if they are not dancing to music, but that somehow music dances them. They look like singing puppets controlled by the music, which captures them in a limbo of peculiar repetitive movements and sounds that eventually become a senseless cacophony. It is the revenge of music. So maybe to play just a little bit of that moment. So the music he's singing is very cleverly used, I think, to represent the underlying history of the event, so to say. And I think that this documentary material indeed, and this particular moment, is the like point de capiton of the whole piece that changes the whole meaning of the whole opera. I would like at the end to show you one more excerpt, something quite different, but again connected to this ventriloquism of bodies and voices. And it's a lament. It's a lament from one of the first operas, sang by the robot. So the Lamentation of Orpheus is a prime example of the uncanny machine voice first performed by the robot in 1999. The piece lasts just 2.5 minutes and was described as a solo choreography for an orange industrial robot to sing Monteverdi's aria from Orfeo, in which Orpheus laments Eurydice's death, vowing to descend to the underworld to bring her back to earth. The piece exists in two modalities, as an installation where the robot performs the choreography live, and as a video recording of the performance. The robot performs the choreography while the aria is heard, with the tenor voice of Karl Annander Scharin, accompanied by an ensemble, all from the recording. This robot becomes vocally alive. It claims the right to have a voice, a right that is usually the exclusive preserved of the human domain. But the balance typical for melodic and vocal style used to express effect in early music corresponds with the machine's supposed emotional restraint in this aria. The small intervals and slow pace of singing are suggestive of sorrow. And those slow melodic gestures and some jumps are followed and synchronized with movements of the robot. What escapes synchronization with choreography are rich vocal ornaments that build tension and excitement and give fullness to emotional expression. The singing tenor voice, combined with the mechanical choreographed movements, constitutes a moment at which those who are usually not allowed to have a voice finally sing. It is a moment of escape from stereotypes. Critical questions are raised about who owns the voice, both for singing and, metaphorically speaking, for being human, and why. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so. Thank you so my voice. Oh. Thank you so much, Jelena, for this very rich and fascinating lecture. We have now about we have 20 minutes, even a bit more if we need, for discussion, questions, thoughts. Floor is open for the audience. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I didn't expect to be quite moved by a robot moving. My question for you is, it's kind of implicit in your presentation, but could you talk a bit more about how it is that the mechanization of performance, like whether there is an additional effect that comes into it, how it comes from before there was a gap between the body and the voice, but then now I know it's the position that, if I'm not mistaken, that you took is that the robot who before technically doesn't have a voice is given a voice. The way that I read it was more of a harmonization, and I liked what you said about removing the stereotype because we no longer have the human body. But again, sorry, just to reiterate my question, would you say that there is an additional performative effect that comes with the mechanization or the inclusion of robotics in performance?
Well, all these examples that I use, both from Aliados and this robot and this device that uses for handicapped people, I use them all actually to show this gap in its various forms, that I think it's really important when we not even talk about singing and performing, but talking and expressing ourselves in general. And in that sense, Žižek was very important to me. When I go back in time, I was struggling with my PhD, which was about this body-voice gap in contemporary opera. And at that point, I went to a doctor because of some problems that I have with my throat. And they wanted to explore more like what happens. And I was at that point in my writing like, okay, we never see the point where we make the voice. Maybe because of that, we also have a traces of ventriloquism. And eventually I saw the place, I saw my vocal cords on that exam because they put some sonda in my nose. And then the doctor said, okay, now you can see when you talk or when you sing. And I was totally perplexed because when you see the vocal cords, then it became totally obvious that the gap is even bigger. Like when we see this like meat structure that produces our voice, it doesn't have anything to do representationally with what we hear or see. Okay, this was a digression. But what you asked, is there like additional performative layer when the robot sings? An effect. In this case, I think yes. But the most interesting things to me in this case was this question, like, is it possible to sing with someone else's voice? Because this is what happens here. This is the real voice of a singer who sang it and who recorded it. And then by precise synchronization, it was choreographed with the movements of the robot. And then, if you don't think maybe a bit deeply about it, okay, it's a recording play with the robot. But on the other hand, I think that the way how it's synchronized gives it a way for that voice to become voice of that robot in a way. Some little miracle happens there because somehow the origin of that voice is not that important anymore, but the movements and the choreography and that performativity that happens in front of us somehow creates this kind of magic, if you wish, that voice really becomes of that mechanical body on stage. And this is why I showed this example, because I think that in this series of examples, that gap is illuminated from different sides, both with the robot, with this machine, of the living being who uses a kind of prosthesis to produce the vocal, but also in opera. I think that opera and all sung, not only opera, like musical and singing in general, works with this gap, and it's so obvious, but we rarely talk about it or rarely theorize it.
Yes, thanks a lot for this. I'm not so used in this topic, but what came to my mind concerning the gap between the body and the voice, I remember, I don't know if you know this video of Freddie Mercury and Montserrat Caballé singing Barcelona.
Yes.
There's, at least in my view, you see Freddie Mercury singing with his whole body. You see how this body rises while he sings, and she's standing there and the voice is somehow coming out of her, but you don't see the bodily expressions in this. Yeah. That was the point when I somehow thought I would understand what happens between the voice and the body and how the voice is inventing the body. And my question is, doesn't that derive from a certain type of singing technique that you find in opera, but maybe not in Freddie Mercury stuff, or however you call it, rock stuff?
Hairy metal stuff. Sorry. No.
Yeah,
so, is this a typical phenomenon of the opera and a certain type of singing, or is it that happens in everyday life as well, this finding this gap as a phenomenon? Since my intention when I saw this robot with his expressions, it was not his voice. I somehow couldn't match up the movement of the robot with the voice. It just seemed, to me, it doesn't seem that the robot was singing, but it was playback. So is there a way of generalizing these aspects you highlighted here to other kinds of using my voice in other situations, and even in some other kinds of singing? Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting questions. Montserrat Caballé and Freddie Mercury. Montserrat is a typical example of, and her way of singing is educated singing in that style of lyric vocal tradition needed for specifically romantic opera. And if we go back to these times, the orchestra was huge. The orchestra after Beethoven grew in number and size. And that became physical problem for the voices, because the vocal apparatus and the volume of the sound that can be produced with one voice is much, much smaller than what instruments can bring in the volume. And this type of vocal technique was produced back then to struggle with that physical phenomenon. Another kind of problem is that this style of singing somehow was maintained even today, when there is amplification. There are all kinds of things that can go beyond this problem. But on the other hand, many of these contemporary operas that I find interesting for one reason or another, they don't use anymore, or they don't use exclusively this style of singing. More and more there is like pop music singing style, folk music style, all kinds of things happening in contemporary opera. So there is no rule connected to that, but I think that you really noticed very well that if Montserrat Caballé's body is a kind of typical body of opera singer, and if you imagine her with wig, with the makeup and heavy costume, very often these operatic bodies were almost immobile on operatic stage before. And then there is this huge voice. This is how I started investigating, because I hated this. And never in my whole education, no one thought it's necessary to, but for me this was absurd. Like, okay, I respect it, it's part of music and opera history, but why this has to be like that? I mean, it's totally absurd. And then with Freddie Mercury, with his way of singing, which is totally different, which comes from popular music, it's completely obvious how these body voices behave differently just to respond. And the second part of question was, is there this body voice gap beyond singing and opera? I think that we live in an increasing ventriloquist world, with all these devices that start to speak, that are giving all kinds of notifications, with now these voice fakes, synchronization that is possible even for use in the news, etc., like this truth problem that is opened. I think it happens. It happens more and more in the reality that we live. And yeah, it will become more problematic, I think. Yeah.
thank you for your presentation, and I also really enjoyed the robot singing. Maybe a short anecdote also to the body-voice gap that I experienced, because I thought at some point, you know, when you sing by your own, it's fine, and so I went and did vocal lessons for like 1-2 times, and it's really absurd what you learn there. It's like I never felt so ashamed in my life, because you really have to dissolve into the tone, and then it's more brutal than acting even, because you're not even like should speak loudly or something. You just sing like an ah and really loud, and then he tells you like, imagine you have some fruit there. So I really have a lot of respect for singers, and the gap is obviously there. And my question sort of would concern the future of opera, which I guess is a really big question. But do you think that it will, like that the orchestra or something will get more dissolved, or because in my experience it's still pretty much an avant-gardistic deadlock since like, I don't know, since like the end of the 40s, and I'm really not sure how opera will develop, or if it's just postmodern and there's no, you know, certain style to it, as there once were. That would be the first thing. And the second thing is, do you think that the automation on the stage could maybe be involved more? Yes.
Yeah, I think maybe the easiest way to understand where opera stands today is like to go back to comparison of classical ballet and modern dance or contemporary dance. Both of these arts, they deal with movement, with rhythm, most often with music, but these are completely different arts, with different education style, with different system of stars. It's not the same art. It doesn't have the same history. It doesn't have the same institutions. They both deal with movements, with choreography, but it's not the same art. I think the same happens with opera. There is conventional opera, which happens mostly in the opera houses and in opera festivals. There is an education for this kind of singers, orchestras, composers, opera studies that follows all this, publication of the recordings, etc. And you know very well where to go and to find this kind of spectacle. And it will live. It has its own audiences, it has its infrastructure. On the other hand, these things that I tend to call post-operas, they are still like terra incognita in a sense of institutionalization, because they tend to happen everywhere. They're site-specific. There was an opera in Los Angeles for 26 limousines happening on the highways. They're happening in the swimming pools. They're happening sometimes on the festivals, sometimes, but more and more, once for a year in an opera house, like an invitation or something. But all these operas go beyond this infrastructure of the opera world, and it's still not very easy to know precisely where to go and to look into it. I think still the book is not written that would map what happens like in general in that world. So that would be the response, like where is opera world today? There are at least 2 opera worlds, I think. And with mechanization on stage, well, it happens. I see it happening more and more. I was recently at the concert. It was not an opera, but with 4 robots and 4 percussionists on stage in Utrecht, opening the festival. I thought it was interesting how it started. It was very intriguing, and the dialogue between the machines and the humans worked very well, and it was a very long piece. And then suddenly I realized that I became very nervous towards the second part of it. And after that, talking with composer friends, we came to conclusion that we became nervous because humans started playing as the machines at some point. It became really, because the machines couldn't, I think, follow all these tiny, not respecting of the rules, I think, in that piece. But it happened the other way around. The humans started accommodating to the rhythms of machines, and that was annoying to me. But it happens in all kinds of ways also. I saw in Amsterdam recently a preview of a piece for the robot and a little ensemble. I already saw virtual reality operas. So there are all kinds of things happening and all kinds of voices singing, which I think is very good to sing in these grim times, especially because there is some strange kind of vulnerability in singing, and while we keep this as a flame, I think it's good.
I think there were two more questions, so
I would go to the others first, maybe here.
and do we have time for both, or shall we collect them?
I think we have like 8 minutes left. So we can go one by one.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Novak, for your lecture. Sorry, I came late, and about more your speech about the voice, of the sources of voice. I have one question. How is important the language in opera? Because, for example, if you mention this singer's Tony Mercury, he has one anomaly in his mouth. He has a very high palate in mouth, and out these sources, out this reason of his anomaly, he has fantastic voice, and together with he sing only in English. And if you hear some opera in Paris, for example, in Palais by the Sea, Carmen, I have hear and seen, and the language French for opera is not so good like German language or Italian language or English language. Do you think it's very important? And my second question is, who is Esteban Buch, the librettist, and the Sebastian River, the composer?
Sebastian Rivas is a composer. Esteban Buch is musicologist and dramaturg. He wrote, among others, the book about Beethoven's Ode to Joy, the whole book about it. And I think also that Žižek had some kind of dialogue with this book when he was talking about the use of the Ode of Joy in his explication of some of the films. To respond to your question about the language, what happens when any language is sang, at some point we start not to understand it. It's a physical phenomenon also. And it doesn't even depend on how good the vocal apparatus of the singer is. With very high pitches, we tend not to understand everything. It just happens like that. And this is why also lots of times in the opera houses they use the subtitles, even when we can understand. So I don't worry too much about the meaning of the words, especially because the subtitles are there, and also lots of times we can read the libretto and we know like what happens in the story. And also I hear opera being sang in all kinds of languages, sometimes on purpose on the languages that we cannot understand, like Philip Glass opera Echnaton was sung in Akkadian language, Akkad language, the old language, which is not in use, I think, anymore. Yes. Yeah, okay. So it's on purpose that the words could not be understood. So I don't see that a big problem, being a big problem for the opera. So.
For me, I'm a Prague, and for me it's a big difference between opera in Wagner German language and also I'm in French opera Carmen. And this is for me, in Carmen it's one poesy.
Yeah, but in contemporary operas, all kinds of things are used for libretto also, even the shopping lists. Or
Okay, we only have a very few couple of minutes left, so we'll go to the last question.
Thank you very much for your communication. Excuse me for my English, which is very poor. I would like to make a clinical observation. I remembered a film. The film is the Nicolas Philibert, La moindre des choses, a film which shows the clinic La Borde, c'est la clinique de Félix Guattari et Jean Houry. Et le film, the film begins with a woman, obviously psychotic, schizophrenic. I would say she is fallen out of the world. And she wanders around in the garden of the clinic, a great garden, and she starts singing the great aria of Orphée de Gluck. Ach, ich habe sie verloren en allemand, in German. And I have the impression the schizophrenic persons are not every time persecuted by the voice, but the voice can help to create a bridge to the world in this gap you have spoken of. A little bit like the Übergangsobjekt chez Winnicott, objet petit a chez Lacan, oui, c'est clair, it's clear. I would like to strengthen this aspect of linking this gap, not only the persecution aspect in the clinic of the psychotic experience.
yeah, thank you very much for this observation. I think you're right. I think you're right. I don't know the film, but I will take it to see it. Thank you.
And with that, I would say we end the discussion for now. We are very good in time. Thank you very much for your great questions. I mean, I could go on for another hour here. I have like 5 or 6 questions.